It was the summer of 1987, a season when the heat of the day met the calmness of long evenings. Four young women, all in their early 20s, boarded a passenger train that was traveling across several states. They were college friends who had been inseparable for years. Each of them carried not just luggage but dreams, hopes, and the excitement of youth. The train was their gateway back home after a short trip together, a trip meant to celebrate their friendship before life would eventually push them in different directions. They had talked about this journey for months, planning small details, even deciding what snacks to pack and which music tapes to bring along. On the platform, people noticed the girls because they were full of life, laughing and talking as though the world belonged to them. They carried backpacks and small suitcases, nothing unusual, but their energy drew attention. Other passengers remembered how they seemed to brighten the air around them. One girl had tied a bright red scarf around her bag, another had a sketchbook she never traveled without. Little details like these would later matter, because those were the last signs people would remember about them. The train moved forward with its usual rhythm, wheels clattering against steel, as the countryside rushed past the windows. Families sat together, businessmen opened newspapers, and tired travelers rested their heads. The four girls shared a compartment, chatting endlessly, sometimes walking along the narrow aisles, meeting new faces, and buying snacks from the food trolley. They looked carefree, and in that moment, no one could imagine the tragedy about to unfold. The journey stretched through small towns and long stretches of empty land. At one stop, a passenger recalled seeing the girls standing near the open door, watching the platform with curiosity. Another man remembered them buying coffee at a small station cafe before quickly returning to the train. Nothing seemed unusual. People assumed they were simply enjoying their trip. But somewhere between two stations, the story changed forever. When the conductor came through the compartments later that evening, he noticed something strange. The girls' seats were empty. Their bags were still there, placed neatly, as if they had just stepped away for a short time. But hours passed, and they never returned. At first, the staff thought they might have moved to another coach, perhaps talking with friends they had made during the ride. A search of the train began first casually, then urgently. The conductor and other staff checked the dining car, the washrooms, even the small storage corners where passengers sometimes sat to rest. But the girls were nowhere to be found. The train stopped at the next station, and railway authorities were alerted. Their names were announced over the loudspeakers, asking them to come forward. Still, nothing. Officers went through every coach, opening compartments, questioning passengers, and shining flashlights into dark corners. Their belongings remained untouched, which only deepened the mystery. Who would leave behind personal items, even their purses, and simply vanish? By nightfall, panic had begun to spread. Some passengers whispered that they might have stepped off at the wrong station and missed the train. Others feared something darker. Parents traveling with their children clutched them tighter, uneasy at the thought that four young women could disappear without a trace in such a confined space. The entire train, once filled with the calm rhythm of travel, now carried a sense of dread. When the train reached the terminal, local police were waiting. Reports were filed, and the girls' families were contacted. Shock turned into grief almost instantly. The parents refused to believe their daughters had simply left on their own. They knew their habits, their fears, their loyalty to each other. Something terrible had happened, and they demanded answers. The following days turned into chaos. Newspapers picked up the story, publishing headlines that read like the beginning of a nightmare: four girls vanish on train journey. Reporters interviewed passengers who had seen them, trying to reconstruct their last moments. Some claimed the girls had been speaking to two strangers in one of the dining areas. Others insisted they had gone quiet and nervous before disappearing. Each account added to the confusion, and no two stories completely matched. For the FBI, who stepped in after the case gained national attention, the mystery was both urgent and deeply puzzling. A moving train was not an easy place for people to simply vanish. There were limited doors, windows that did not open easily, and dozens of witnesses. Yet, somehow, the four young women had disappeared in a way that made no logical sense. Their families held onto hope in the beginning. They believed the girls would be found in a nearby town, maybe victims of a mix-up, maybe wandering somewhere in need of help. But as days turned into weeks, hope became heavy with fear. The mothers and fathers traveled to every station along the train's route, showing photographs, begging for information. They searched shelters, hospitals, even remote villages, but no one had seen the four friends. The more the investigators looked, the stranger the case became. There were no signs of a struggle in their compartment, no fingerprints out of place, no blood, no broken locks. The girls' luggage remained exactly as it was. Their sketchbook, scarf, and personal diaries were left behind, untouched, as though they had simply dissolved into thin air. The absence of clues made the mystery even more terrifying. At night, family members stayed awake, replaying the last conversations they had with their daughters before the trip. One girl had promised to call as soon as she reached home. Another had said she would bring back souvenirs for her little sister. Those promises, so ordinary and simple, became heartbreaking reminders of the sudden silence that followed. By the end of the summer, the missing case had turned into one of the darkest puzzles of the decade. The train company was questioned, staff members were investigated, and hundreds of passengers were interviewed. Still, there was no breakthrough. The train itself was inspected over and over, but nothing revealed the truth. Whispers spread among the public. Some believed the girls had been kidnapped by an organized group. Others said they might have uncovered something they were never meant to see. And in the shadows of small towns along the route, strange rumors floated about hidden tunnels near the tracks, about secret compartments in old trains, about stories too unbelievable to print. Through it all, the families held vigils, praying for the safe return of their daughters. Candles lit up church steps and community halls, their flames flickering against the night sky, symbols of both hope and despair. Strangers joined the search, offering tips and sending letters of support. Yet nothing brought the girls back. The train continued its journeys on the same tracks, carrying new passengers, but for those who remembered that summer, the carriages would always hold a ghostly emptiness. An unanswered question hung in the air: how could four young women vanish without leaving a single trace? That question would not find even the beginning of an answer for another 25 years. But in 1987, all anyone knew was the heartbreak of families waiting at the door, the silence of empty rooms, and the chilling mystery of four friends who boarded a train and never came home. The disappearance of the four girls quickly became a matter far too complex for the local authorities alone. Within days of their vanishing, the FBI stepped in, sending a team of investigators to take over what was already being called one of the most baffling cases of the decade. The agents arrived with urgency, carrying files, equipment, and a determination to piece together what had happened during that train journey. They set up a temporary command center in one of the towns near the train's route, where they could work day and night, gathering every bit of information. The first step was interviewing passengers. More than 200 people had been aboard the train during that journey, and each one was asked to recall their memories of the four girls. Some passengers described them in detail: their laughter, the way one of them kept sketching in her notebook, how another had tied that bright scarf around her bag. Others could only vaguely remember seeing them pass through the aisles or chatting near the dining car. When pressed about the hours leading to their disappearance, the stories became inconsistent. A few witnesses swore the girls had been seen with two men near the cafe section, but others insisted the young women were last noticed together, alone, in their compartment. The FBI noted every detail, but the contradictions left the picture cloudy. The train staff were questioned next. Conductors, attendants, and cleaning personnel were asked to recall anything unusual. One conductor admitted he found it strange that the girls' belongings were untouched while their seats remained empty for hours. Another attendant confessed she assumed they had gotten off at one of the smaller stations without telling anyone, which some passengers occasionally did. Yet when shown the items left behind, all agreed it made no sense. Who leaves behind purses, diaries, and even half-eaten snacks? The FBI agents wrote their reports with growing concern. The clues were far too few, and the possibilities far too many. The physical search of the train itself came next. Every compartment, every storage room, every hidden corner was inspected. Agents crawled under seats, shined lights into ventilation ducts, and tapped against the walls to check for hollow spaces. The train was kept stationary for several days at the yard, guarded closely while teams combed it inch by inch. Yet not a single sign of the girls was discovered. The only items connected to them were their belongings, which offered no hint of where they had gone. Meanwhile, the surrounding areas near the stations were searched. Police dogs were brought in to sniff out any trail. Fields, forests, and abandoned buildings were combed by search parties. Flyers with the girls' faces were pinned to telephone poles, shop windows, and bus stops. Families traveled to each location, pleading with locals for information. But no one had seen four young women walking away from a station, nor had they been spotted in nearby towns. It was as if they had stepped off the train and vanished into thin air. The FBI expanded their investigation. They checked records of known criminals operating along the train's route, particularly those involved in abductions or organized crimes. They interviewed railway workers from other shifts, hoping someone might recall unusual maintenance activity or suspicious characters lurking around. They even looked into passengers who had booked one-way tickets on that same train, thinking perhaps someone had planned the disappearance. Every lead, however, seemed to collapse into nothing. The families of the girls were devastated. They attended meeting after meeting with agents, demanding answers, clinging to every shred of hope. Fathers paced hallways while mothers wept quietly, holding photographs of their daughters. Younger siblings asked questions no one could answer: where are they, why haven't they come home, why can't the police find them? For the families, every day without news was torture. The FBI tried to reassure them that the case was a priority, but as the weeks stretched into months, reassurance turned into silence. The media played a powerful role in keeping the case alive. Newspapers printed headlines daily, calling the incident the mystery on the midnight train. Television crews interviewed neighbors, professors, and friends of the missing girls. Reporters revisited the railway stations, standing on platforms with cameras, describing the eerie sense of absence. Public pressure on the FBI grew, and the agents knew the country was watching closely. Still, despite all efforts, no new evidence surfaced. The investigators even considered unusual possibilities. Could the girls have staged their disappearance? Could they have run away together for reasons unknown? But such theories fell apart when they studied the girls' lives. They were hardworking, close to their families, and had left behind everything important. Their diaries, letters, and conversations all pointed to ordinary young women looking forward to their futures. Running away made no sense. By the end of that year, the investigation had reached a painful dead end. The case files grew thicker, filled with reports, photographs, and notes from endless interviews. Yet every page told the same story: four friends boarded a train, were seen by dozens of people, and then were never seen again. The lack of physical evidence frustrated even the most seasoned agents. People don't just disappear, one investigator said during a press conference. But in this case, they had. The families refused to give up. They continued their own searches, often retracing the train's path themselves, stopping in small towns to ask questions. Some even hired private investigators, hoping fresh eyes might find what the FBI had missed. The pain became part of their daily lives, etched into every conversation, every family gathering where the absence of their daughters was felt like a wound that would not heal. The case officially became a cold case after several years, though the FBI promised it would never be closed entirely. For the agents who had worked tirelessly, it became one of those mysteries that haunted their careers. Some retired with the memory of it still sharp in their minds, still wondering what had gone wrong. Others transferred to new assignments but carried the weight of unanswered questions. In the meantime, rumors spread among the public. Some believed the train had been carrying something secret that the girls had discovered. Others speculated they had been taken by people powerful enough to silence any investigation. Conspiracy theories blossomed, filling the void left by the lack of facts. For the families, these rumors only deepened their grief, for each suggestion painted a new and terrifying picture of what might have happened. 25 years would pass before a single clue surfaced again. But in those early years after 1987, the FBI investigation was a desperate search through shadows. Every detail mattered, every interview was crucial, yet no combination of facts led to the truth. It was as if the four friends had been swallowed by the rails themselves, leaving behind only questions that no one could answer. And so, the investigation ended with silence, a silence that would stretch on for decades, until time itself forced the mystery back into the light. Years turned into decades, but the memory of the four missing girls never faded completely. For their families, the pain became a constant part of life, like a shadow that followed them everywhere. Each birthday, each holiday, each family gathering felt incomplete. Mothers still set aside a plate at the table as if their daughters might walk through the door at any moment. Fathers aged with sorrow, their eyes carrying the weight of questions that had no answers. Younger siblings grew up telling stories about sisters they barely remembered. What once had been a story on every newspaper headline slowly turned into a cold memory stored in yellowing files and dusty archives. By the late 1990s, the case was remembered mostly by locals and true crime enthusiasts who often brought it up as one of the strangest unsolved mysteries of the 1980s. There were books and articles that speculated wildly about what might have happened. Some authors claimed it was an elaborate abduction planned by criminals. Others leaned into darker theories about hidden tunnels or secret compartments in trains. None of these theories were ever proven, and all of them left the families frustrated. To them, the mystery wasn't entertainment, it was the daily reality of waiting for answers that never came. As the 25th anniversary of the disappearance approached, the FBI still carried the case under its cold case unit. New technologies had developed in the years since 1987, especially DNA analysis and digital record keeping. What had once been impossible to examine could now be tested in advanced laboratories. In 2012, an archivist working in the FBI evidence storage facility stumbled across a sealed box. It had been sitting untouched for decades, containing personal items recovered from the train. The archivist, curious and careful, reopened the old case files and requested permission to have the items re-examined. Inside the box were things most people had forgotten: articles of clothing, a sketchbook, a coffee cup, and several items that had belonged to passengers seated near the girls. At the time of the original investigation, DNA testing wasn't widely used, and many of these items had been stored without further analysis. But in 2012, technology had advanced far enough to extract even the smallest traces of genetic material. Samples were carefully collected and sent to a modern FBI laboratory. When the first results came back, they were astonishing. On one of the items, investigators found DNA that matched a man who had once worked as a maintenance employee for the train company in 1987. The man had since passed away, but his profile existed in the system because of unrelated investigations connected to organized crime. Suddenly, after 25 years of silence, the case had a direction again. The FBI reopened the files and pulled together a new task force. Agents pored over the original reports, re-interviewed surviving staff members, and began tracing the history of the maintenance worker. They discovered he had been assigned to that very train on the night the girls disappeared. At the time, he had been considered an ordinary employee, and no one had thought to suspect him. Yet his name had surfaced in old reports about suspicious activity involving train cargo, though nothing had ever been proven. Detectives began searching through historical records, train blueprints, and maintenance logs. That's when they discovered something chilling. Old documents suggested that some trains from that era contained hidden compartments, areas not accessible to passengers, designed originally for storage or smuggling. These compartments weren't visible to the naked eye and could easily have gone unnoticed by investigators in the 1980s. The thought that the girls might have stumbled upon something hidden during their journey suddenly seemed plausible. Perhaps they had walked through a part of the train they weren't supposed to, or maybe one of them saw the wrong thing at the wrong time. Investigators could not say for sure, but the pieces were beginning to connect. Families were contacted again. After years of silence, the phone calls from the FBI were both hopeful and heartbreaking. Parents who had aged through decades of waiting listened quietly as agents explained that new evidence had surfaced. Tears flowed as they heard that the search for answers was not over, that the case of their daughters was no longer forgotten in dusty files. For some families, the call brought back all the pain they had worked so hard to bury. For others, it felt like the first step toward closure. The news of the reopened case spread quickly, and soon it was all over the media again. Reporters revisited the families, showing photographs of the four girls as they had been in 1987, smiling, carefree, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Television anchors spoke of new DNA technology, old train secrets, and the possibility that after 25 years, the country might finally learn the truth. Detectives returned to the rail yard where old train cars were stored. Some of the original coaches from 1987 had been scrapped, but others remained, rusting quietly in abandoned corners. With tools, flashlights, and forensic equipment, the team searched every inch. They tapped along the metal walls, removed panels, and followed blueprints line by line. In one of the forgotten carriages, they found evidence that parts of the train had once been altered secret storage areas that matched the suspicions raised by the old documents. What they discovered didn't solve the case immediately, but it proved something critical: the train had indeed been hiding places where people or objects could be concealed. This raised chilling possibilities about what had really happened on that summer night in 1987. The families gathered together when the FBI held a private briefing. Photos of the evidence, DNA results, and blueprints were shown. The agents didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in 25 years, they had a solid lead. Parents who had nearly given up hope sat silently, their hands trembling, their hearts heavy with a mixture of sorrow and relief. At last, someone was taking their daughter's disappearance seriously again. The public reaction was overwhelming. Newspapers ran front-page headlines once more. FBI reopens 1987 train mystery became the story of the week. Social media erupted with discussions, theories, and sympathy for the families. People who had never even been alive in 1987 were suddenly fascinated, sharing articles and documentaries about the case. For the FBI, however, it was not about headlines. It was about finding the truth, no matter how much time had passed. With the evidence now pointing to a man long gone and to secret spaces within the train, they knew the investigation was far from over. They had uncovered the beginning of the truth, but the full story remained buried in the shadows of history, waiting to be brought to light. The reopening of the case in 2012 brought new energy, but it also brought new fears. For the first time in 25 years, there was a clear direction to follow, and the FBI task force was determined to uncover every piece of truth hidden behind the mystery of the vanished girls. Agents reviewed the blueprints of the train over and over again. These were old documents, stored away in railway company archives, and some had to be retrieved from dusty cabinets that had not been touched for decades. What they revealed stunned the investigators. the train had compartments that were not listed in the standard maps given to passengers or even junior staff. These spaces were built during a time when smuggling goods across state lines was more common, and they had been hidden so well that ordinary inspections never found them. The thought that the girls may have wandered into or discovered one of these secret spaces grew stronger with every piece of evidence. Perhaps they had noticed something strange. Perhaps one of them had seen a hatch slightly open or heard a noise that drew their attention. The fact that the maintenance worker whose DNA was recovered had access to these compartments gave the theory even more weight. He had been trusted with keeping the train in order, which meant he knew every hidden panel and storage corner that no one else did. Agents tracked down people who had worked with him in the 1980s. Most of them were older now, retired, some even ill. When questioned, some admitted they had heard rumors back then about strange shipments on certain trains. Others recalled whispers about compartments used for illegal cargo, but no one dared to speak too much at the time. The man in question had died years earlier, taking with him whatever secrets he had kept, but his shadow lingered in every story. The FBI expanded the investigation beyond the train itself. They looked into records of organized crime groups that had operated in the region during the 1980s. Files revealed that certain gangs had strong ties to the railway lines, using them as a discreet way to move contraband. Could it be that the four girls had unknowingly walked into the middle of something dangerous? The agents believed so. The new evidence suggested the girls may not have been the original target but rather innocent witnesses who stumbled into a world they were never meant to see. Forensic teams returned to the abandoned rail yards where several carriages from that era were still rusting away. The cars were stripped of paint, their seats torn out, but the structure remained. Investigators crawled through them, using tools to pry open hidden panels. In one particular carriage, they uncovered faint traces of human presence, fingerprints too old to match, fragments of fabric caught in rusted metal, and markings that hinted at hasty repairs. While the evidence was not enough to give absolute answers, it painted a chilling picture. Something had happened inside those hidden spaces, something no passenger should have been near. The families of the girls were brought in for another briefing. Photographs of the compartments were shown, and the agents explained how these spaces had been overlooked for so many years. The parents listened in silence, their eyes fixed on the images of narrow, dark chambers where their daughters may have spent their final moments. Tears fell freely, but there was also anger. For decades, these details had been buried, ignored, or forgotten, while they lived with unanswered questions. Some families asked how it was possible that such compartments had not been found during the original investigation. The FBI admitted the technology and resources at the time were limited, but the explanation did little to ease the pain. The discovery of the maintenance worker's DNA also led to a deeper search into his background. Investigators pieced together his life, uncovering that he had been associated with a group suspected of moving illegal items through the railway system. He had never been charged, but his name appeared repeatedly in documents from the 1980s. While he was no longer alive to answer questions, the connection was undeniable. His presence on the train the very night the girls disappeared could not be dismissed as coincidence. As these findings came to light, the media once again erupted. News channels aired documentaries showing the train routes, interviewing former staff, and illustrating how hidden compartments could have existed right under the passengers' feet. The nation was captivated, both horrified and fascinated. People questioned how such a tragedy could remain hidden for 25 years. Social media was flooded with theories, some realistic, others wild, but the attention ensured that the story stayed alive in public memory. Meanwhile, investigators pressed on. They looked into the railway company records, searching for missing maintenance logs or unusual reports from the summer of 1987. They found gaps, periods where paperwork had been altered or disappeared. It became clear that someone, perhaps many people, had worked to cover up activities on the train during that era. Whether the disappearance of the girls had been part of that cover-up or an accident that spiraled out of control was still uncertain. In their search for physical proof, agents turned to advanced ground-penetrating radar and forensic excavation techniques. They examined the old rail yard more closely, especially areas where abandoned cars had been buried or dismantled. It was during one of these digs that they made another shocking discovery: fragments of personal items linked to passengers from that train. A broken charm bracelet, a torn piece of fabric, and other small items were recovered. None could be directly confirmed as belonging to the missing girls, but they strongly suggested that hidden activities had taken place. The breakthrough gave the families a fragile sense of progress. They had lived for decades in the dark, not knowing whether their daughters had been alive for hours, days, or never after that night. The idea that investigators were now finding real, tangible signs reignited their emotions. Closure was still distant, but the possibility of truth seemed closer than ever. As the investigation deepened, the theory grew stronger: the four girls had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They may have seen or heard something in one of the hidden compartments. The maintenance worker, tied to criminal networks, may have acted to silence them. And when the train reached the terminal, their absence was disguised behind confusion and deliberate misdirection. What shocked investigators most was how ordinary the setting had been. A crowded passenger train, filled with families, business travelers, and staff, had also been the stage for one of the darkest secrets in recent history. By the end of 2012, the FBI shared its findings with the public. Though they could not provide every answer, they revealed enough to show that the case was no longer just a mystery but part of a larger story involving hidden crimes and forgotten compartments. The nation was stunned. People who had barely remembered the headlines from 1987 now watched in disbelief as the truth began to emerge. What had seemed like an unsolvable puzzle was now unraveling piece by piece. For the families, it was both painful and powerful. They finally had proof that their daughters had not simply vanished into thin air. Something real had happened on that train, something terrible and deliberate. Though justice could no longer be delivered to the man at the center of it, the truth was beginning to shine through the fog of decades. The case had moved from silence into revelation, and the country could no longer look away. The year 2012 marked a turning point in the story that had haunted families and investigators for a quarter of a century. When the FBI finally revealed its findings to the public, the country was stunned. For years, people had treated the disappearance of the four girls as an unsolved mystery, one of those tragic stories that lived only in memory and rumor. Now the truth was unfolding, and it was more shocking than anyone had imagined. News outlets across the nation ran headlines about the case, sharing the story on every channel and in every newspaper. The names of the four girls returned to the front pages, accompanied by their smiling photographs from 1987, faces frozen in youth while decades had passed without them. The families stood before cameras at press conferences, their grief visible in every wrinkle and every tear. They spoke of daughters who had been full of life, of dreams that had been stolen too soon. Some parents struggled to find words, choking back sobs as they thanked investigators for not giving up. Others spoke firmly, demanding that the truth be pursued further, even if the main suspect was long gone. The entire nation listened as mothers and fathers described the pain of living 25 years with no answers, and now the mix of sorrow and relief that came with at least knowing part of the story. Communities rallied around them. Vigils were held in the towns where the girls had grown up, candles glowing softly against the night sky. Old friends who had once laughed with them in classrooms or shared secrets in cafeterias returned as adults, standing shoulder to shoulder in remembrance. Neighbors placed flowers and photos at memorials, and church bells rang in honor of the lives lost. The tragedy had touched not just four families but an entire generation that remembered the fear of 1987, when the girls had vanished without a trace. For the FBI, the case became an example of perseverance. Though justice could not be served in the way it once might have, the agents had proven that time did not erase truth. Their hard work revealed that the disappearance was not a random mystery but part of a larger, hidden story involving organized crime and the misuse of railway systems. The discovery of the secret compartments and the link to the maintenance worker showed that the girls had likely been silenced because they had seen something they were never meant to. It was a chilling conclusion, but it was also a clear explanation that replaced decades of unanswered questions. The public reacted with both outrage and sorrow. Many were shocked that such a crime could have gone unnoticed on a crowded train filled with ordinary people. Others expressed anger that the investigation in the 1980s had missed critical details. If the compartments had been found then, if the background of the maintenance worker had been investigated more deeply, perhaps the truth would have surfaced sooner. Commentators and writers spoke of the tragedy as a lesson in why no case should ever be abandoned, no matter how hopeless it seems at the time. Documentaries and articles flooded television and print. Journalists retraced the train route, interviewing former passengers who still remembered the eerie silence after the girls disappeared. Survivors of that journey described the fear that spread among passengers that night, fear that had never left them. Writers described how the discovery of the truth had reopened old wounds but also given the nation closure. It was not the ending anyone had hoped for, but it was at least an ending. For the families, closure was complicated. Knowing the truth did not bring their daughters back, and the fact that the man connected to their disappearance had died years earlier left them without the justice they longed for. Yet there was comfort in finally understanding what had happened. The unknown was often worse than the truth, and now they could stop wondering whether their daughters had simply walked away or chosen another life. They could grieve with certainty, knowing they had been victims, not deserters. Memorial services were held once again, but this time they were not vigils for the missing, they were tributes to lives remembered. People spoke of the girls' kindness, their laughter, their dreams of becoming teachers, artists, and professionals. Their stories were retold so the world would not forget them as victims of a crime but as young women who had lived with joy and promise. Scholarships were even set up in their names at local schools, ensuring that their legacy would help others pursue education and opportunity. The FBI agents who had worked on the reopened case shared their reflections too. Some admitted it was the most haunting investigation of their careers. Others said it was a reminder of why they chose the job, to give families answers, even when it takes decades. The case was used in training new agents as an example of why cold cases must be revisited whenever technology improves. It became a symbol of persistence and the belief that even the smallest clue, preserved carefully, can one day unlock the truth. Across the country, the story left people reflecting on the fragility of safety. A simple train ride, something thousands of people took every day, had turned into a nightmare for 4 families. The realization that the tragedy had been hidden for so long left many uneasy, but it also sparked conversations about the importance of transparency, accountability, and never ignoring missing persons cases. People demanded stricter protections for travelers and more thorough investigations whenever young people vanished. Though the case officially closed with the findings in 2012, its echoes remained. The families continued to honor their daughters each year, gathering to remember them not just for how they were lost but for how they had lived. Strangers from across the country wrote letters to express sympathy, some admitting they had been children in 1987 and had never forgotten the fear of reading about the girls who disappeared on the train. Teachers used the story as a way to remind students about resilience, about the importance of truth, and about the human need to keep searching for answers even when the trail seems cold. In the end, the disappearance of the 4 girls was no longer just a mystery, it became a story of courage, patience, and the unbreakable bond of family. It showed how tragedy could remain hidden for decades, yet still come to light when persistence meets opportunity. It proved that while justice may not always be served in the way people hope, the truth carries its own kind of power. And for the families, knowing what had happened allowed them to finally begin healing, even as the memory of their daughters remained forever in their hearts. The nation never forgot them. Their story lived on, not just in the files of the FBI, but in the hearts of people who believed in the importance of never giving up. The candlelight vigils, the photographs on mantles, the scholarships in their names all became part of a legacy that turned grief into remembrance. The four girls boarded a train in 1987 and never returned, but their story traveled far beyond that journey, leaving lessons for generations to come.